Welcome to SciTech Culture with Steve Kern and Ben Warner, where we examine science, technology and culture in the 21st century. Visit our website at scitechculture.com.
Hello, and it's SciTech Culture time again for another week. Steve, welcome back. It's another interesting week where there's a lot to cover. I did want to sort of pick up from last week. We sort of touched on the Twitter ban censorship thing, obviously because of the Trump ban and stuff, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as we go along, because I think that topic, as we said last week, could be unpacked just on its own. But just to start with, thought I'd I had to run this past you, the old this whole story about the iPhone 12 mini potentially ramping down production because I guess sales are not there. And I knew that would potentially have an impact on you. It would be like, I would think with a company of Apple's size that they could keep a couple of models going even if one of them doesn't pull its weight potentially, but I guess it's a business, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. Every time I try to get back into Apple, nowadays they keep trying to keep me out. It's the mini's the way back in for me. If they take that away, maybe I'll reconsider. But I guess they're going to lower production. I do imagine it must be competing with the SE2.
Yeah.
Which I see a lot of people very happy with. So, I mean, I see a lot of value in the Mini, but maybe most people, if they want a lower-end phone, just go straight for the SE.
And maybe that's what it is. I mean, the main difference between those two phones is that technically with the 12 Mini, you're getting the size of the SE, relatively speaking, but with flagship features, I guess. But the thing is, the SE2 really has a lot of flagship features in it already, and if you're going to go for that type of phone, you're probably going to be picking up the SE rather than the Mini, simply because if you wanted all the high spec features, you're probably going to end up buying the either the 12 or the 12 Pro models, regardless.
Maybe luckily for me or something, Apple just chopped the price on the Mini just to get rid of it, and I'll be there.
Oh, you'll just have to pick them up on eBay after the fact or something. Alrighty. Okay, well, we'll just move on to this other story. And again, picking up from, I believe we discussed this last year, this whole thing about Google and its spat with the Australian government about proposed media laws that would force Google to pay for presenting news content on their site, with the latest escalation this week being that Google's threatening to leave Australia should these laws come up, be implemented. It's kind of undercut, though, by the fact that they somehow managed to do a deal with the French government for almost exactly the same thing and managed to stay in the country, but to me, this just seems like another, I don't know, poker-esque attempt at, move kind of thing, who's bluffing, who's going to do what or whatever. They're not going to leave, but, it's to me, it just seems like a very Google way of looking at the world in an attempt to try and strong-arm because they think that they've got the power to do so.
It's interesting. It's one of these ploys that are exactly the same as any Google product. It's a pretty good idea, I guess, but it's just dumb. It doesn't work properly. It doesn't make any sense. If Google goes, we'll just all move to Bing.
Yeah, and Microsoft will be super happy.
It really doesn't make any sense at all, any of what they're saying. So if they removed Australian news from their search terms, which they tell us they can't do, like to hide innocent victims' names or whatever, but they can, quite clearly. If they do remove Australian news, big deal. I don't think that's actually the issue. I mean, or I should say, I think that's a separate issue around the media, payment for media.
Yeah.
In terms of the misinformation, then it's probably a good thing because it stops the misuse or the misconstruction of news stories, which is also part of the disinformation. So anyway, to me, I'd be quite happy if Google didn't strike a deal with Australian media and pulled out of Australia altogether. I would welcome them to go ahead. I wouldn't feel any poorer.
Indeed. Alrighty.
They can take Android with them too when they go.
that could potentially make some interesting mobile operating system, I don't know, monopolies emerging or something. All right, so we'll get on to our main topic now, which was, I guess, broadly speaking, social media censorship. And obviously this whole debate got really started again in earnest when Donald Trump got banned from Twitter, and looks like he's been permanently banned from multiple social media sites, and the subsequent discussions that have now started around that. That if you think of it in broad terms, it was a very sort of, anvil-like approach to dealing with Trump's Twitter feed and all of his social media postings. What was the standard used? Why wasn't it done earlier? Why was, when there was a lot of things that he posted in the past which would have gotten a normal user kicked off? And it seemed like, the Capitol riot was the one step too far, that they felt the need to step in, although it's a little bit like, well, it's easy to do now because he's only there for another 2 weeks kind of thing as the president. So now that he's almost a normal citizen, now we can treat him like a normal citizen. And I guess that kind of spirals out onto so many things. So how is it that, they police these things going forward now that they've kind of set a precedent in a way for banning someone who was inflaming situations on social media?
Well, that's right, and I think you've summed it up pretty succinctly there, Ben. I don't think there's really much else that can be said. They could have banned Trump at any time, but they didn't. They can shut down anything they want, even though they say they can't at any time, and they don't. And for anyone who's really done any sort of exploration of the socials, and I'll include LinkedIn on this, which everyone seems to think is a highly professional, clean product. You dig around on them and you find the same things, the same undesirable activities, the same undesirable thinking, and illegal activities, horrible activities are all conducted on the socials. And I think that really is the much wider issue. There's a business model associated with all of these platforms. And it's not a good business model. It's a broken business model. I don't necessarily blame the social networks for these issues themselves, but unfortunately they're the ones stuck with the problem. And, if the business model's broken and it's not good for you, then you got to fix it, or you got to abide by the rules. And we were talking about this briefly last week. I don't think this is a matter of regulation. I think it's a matter of legislation. And we're going to talk about, I think, Section 230 is it in a minute. You've got to make it very black and white, and you've got to make people responsible, because it's weird. If you defame on Facebook or Twitter, you'll have to pay, but the publisher doesn't. And that goes completely against every sort of artistic model, business model, or creative business model that there is. So, and classical media model that there is. So I don't quite, if you defame in a newspaper, the paper is responsible, or the publisher is responsible. And I just don't think we can get around the fact that they're publishing platforms.
All right, so let's unpack that a little bit more in relation to what are they. So the Section 230 legislation in America, which is actually dated, it was actually more designed for actual publishers back in 80s or 90s. I can't remember when it was put in, but there's an equivalent law, I guess, here in Australia, I think, just in relation to publishers being held responsible for this sort of thing. But for the internet and anyone that's on the internet there, it's like how you said, the publisher or the social media sites in these instances are not held responsible for whatever users post on their site. Now, there's the argument that you were just putting forward there about, yet they are publishers, they should be held responsible. The other side of the argument is that depending on how the legislation, I guess, is rewritten to cover this scenario, it could be a blank. It could also have some unintended effects where if you've got take us for instance, we've got a site. You can write comments on it. Does that mean that we have to now potentially police our entire comments board, 24/7 because certain people are posting, defamatory or whatever other material on it? So that would make it, like, if that were to happen, like, I'm sure we'd have a discussion, but I'm pretty sure I'd be taking the comments board down almost immediately if that was the case.
This is interesting because I think that this was the original intent for 230. So people were, back in the early days, were posting. So it wasn't like anyone could post back in those days, which was, I think, the late 90s. But you'd have a news story and somebody would write something defamatory about the person in the story. So the idea was that it wasn't fair for the media company that published the story then to be responsible for an individual's comments, which you can argue is fair enough.
Mm.
However, now the world's moved on. We're 25 years in the future, and I can publish my own story, which is completely defamatory, or I can twist an existing story to troll, to be nasty, to do things that are completely unacceptable. And that law now is working in the illegal activities favour. So I just think it has to be viewed like that. And if the model doesn't work, well, that's too bad for the socials. I mean, the other side of it is that if you really want to close the loop, then everybody who uses the internet has to identify themselves. And, I don't know really why anyone would even be bothered about that now, because they're taking all your data and selling it when you think you're anonymous.
Is it possible though that you think of when something like Section 230 was first written, that it couldn't obviously take into account an environment like the one we're in now and the platforms that we've got now, and that potentially whatever the new version of it is has to be more nuanced than what this one is? Because on the one hand, although I can see an argument for what I was saying before about shutting down commentary out of fear that you'll get sued, the flip side is that they're very clearly instigating a lot of illegal activity because the platforms are allowing it, or not even just illegal activity, just
undesirable activity.
And
immoral activity,
leading people down thought patterns that they never would have engaged in, and that sort of thing, which clearly needs to be dealt with. It's a hard one.
Let's go pre-2010, because that was the last vestiges probably. By then the bull had already bolted, but let's go back, say, to around 2000, between 2000 and 2010. The point was, at any of these stages, this idea of free speech, etc., there are enough media channels out there. The socials didn't evolve because there wasn't enough opportunity for free speech anywhere in a liberal democracy.
Mm.
Okay? And if you want free speech, you can still go to Speaker's Corner. If you want free speech, you can still print your own newsletter on paper and hand it out in the city. If you want free speech, you can go to your local newspaper or local television channel. So none of this evolved because, free speech was under threat. In fact, if anything, we've seen free speech under threat now because of the socials. And we've found rational, balanced reporting under threat because of the socials. Now, once again, don't necessarily blame the companies, but their business models have given rise to this. I do have one question though, Ben, which is interesting. Does Twitter use algorithms to the same extent that Facebook does, or if you post on Twitter, can anyone see it?
Oh, I thought if you post it on Twitter, anyone can see it.
So
I mean, I would think. I mean, there's a
social model.
Yeah, I mean, though I'm sure it's a mixture because there's a feed, that I'm sure curates based on who you've followed, etc. So I don't know if it's quite the same as Facebook in that sense, but I think there's an element of that anyway. But yeah. I think technically it's just everyone posts whatever, and you can do, and then you can look up whatever you want, which leads me to maybe a final point. And you were mentioning free speech there, is that I just feel like there's also a lot of liberty being taken with that term, with those terms as well, free speech. You know, I've tweeted this out, that's my right to free speech. And it's like, no, actually, you're posting that on a private company's platform, and they manage the platform. They've set the terms and conditions for that platform. They can take it away from you if they want. And, you know, yes, they've got conditions for why they would do that, but actually they could do it whenever they want. And that's the bit that is kind of driving me a bit nuts, that people are actually thinking that they've got a right to free speech on these platforms when, you know, they're not public squares in that sense.
And it's not free speech either. And that's the reason I asked the question about Twitter, because on Facebook, they provide you the audience. You don't get anyone by accident on Facebook. And so that's not free speech.
Yeah.
If your audience is provided by the platform, that cannot be free speech by any definition. If anything, that's preaching, and that's advertising, which is the Facebook model. Twitter, I'm sure, use a similar variation on probably who you like or follow. But, you know, effectively, there might be grounds for Twitter to claim, well, that is free speech. And also Twitter has a slightly different role, I guess, amongst the socials. But that doesn't mean that it should be any more exempt or any more free. So I just think these are very interesting questions, because there's no free speech when your audience is curated for you.
No.
Cultivated for you. That's not free speech. And when you're not open to debate, when you're merely, you know, posting a diatribe and effectively, you know, small-minded manifesto.
And I have to also wonder what the whole free speech thing means anyway, when these people are jumping up and down saying their free speech is being denied, yet they're using some anonymous Twitter handle to say it. And it's like, well, you can't have it both ways too.
No, look, I think there's very few people that actually use the internet for good, unfortunately, as I think the last 25 years has proven. And if anyone doesn't believe me, start up a false Facebook account and go digging. Just, you know, don't be too horrified by the people that you meet.
Yeah, well, there's a nice little rabbit hole to end up with. All right, Steve, I might...
the same on LinkedIn.
Yeah. All right, Steve, I might wrap it up there, and I guess we'll follow it. I think what will be interesting is now that we're well and truly past, you know, the sort of Trump presidency as it is for now, that'll be actually be a good example to follow, to see if he ends up resurfacing in some way, and whether or not any of that will continue, and how you know, the whole debate around this discussion of Section 230 in America in particular, and whether or not they'll actually make adjustments to it going forward. Exactly.
I do wonder what's going to happen now. You and I have spoken about this for a long time, and it's constantly evolving. But I guess the next few months we'll see what happens. But I would suspect that in the post-Trump world, our large sort of tech companies are in for a whole new environment again.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so don't forget our website, scitechculture.com. You can get all of our links and content there. You can subscribe to our YouTube and Vimeo channels, our RSS feeds, and watch us on any and all of your devices. And we greatly appreciate your visits to our website. All right, so that's it for this episode. We'll catch you next time.